At the end of World War II, the Allied powers decided to form a new global security council, and this time it had to be effective. It was to become the United Nations. The UN currently has 193 member states, and it's the world's largest organization. How was it created? And more importantly, how effective has it been? The League of Nations had been formed after World War I, in the hope that it could prevent further mass conflict and bloodshed. However, without America, the League of Nations failed to stop the onset of World War II, and the world was once again plunged into war. This time on a much larger scale. The United Nations was formed in 1945. It was mainly initiated by all of the three Allied powers: Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The Allied leaders had met through World War II to discuss the needs for a post-war system of global cooperation. In 1943, the US, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China met in Moscow to agree on forming an organization that would safeguard world peace. This was to become the United Nations. The 1943 declaration specified that such an organization was, to quote, necessary for the maintenance of international peace and security. In April 1945, the United Nations Conference was held in San Francisco. Representatives from 50 countries around the world attended the conference to discuss the idea of a global security and welfare organization. It was widely agreed upon that such a body was crucial to ensure a smoother running global community, and in October of 1945, the UN Charter was signed. From the outset, though, there was debate over how this new global council would operate. It was stated that a fair system would give equal say to each nation, regardless of its size or influence. This was addressed by creating the General Assembly, which gave each member nation one vote. However, this equality was seriously questioned when the Security Council was formed. The Security Council's main priorities are to ensure international peace and to admit prospective new nations, making it one of the more important bodies of the UN. In 1945, it was decided that the Security Council would be made up of 5 permanent nations and 6 non-permanent. The 5 permanent nations were, and still are, Britain, the US, China, France, and the Soviet Union, which now functions as Russia. Added to this was that each permanent member was allowed the power to veto. Veto power basically means that if one representative doesn't agree with a policy or a resolution, then they can vote against it. This has always been a point of contention amongst non-permanent nations who argue that permanent members can use their veto power in self-interest. In 1945, the United Nations released its charter, which stipulated the key goals of the organization. They were, and still are, to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect and the principle of equal rights, and to ensure the self-determination of all people. With the exception of a few tweaks and modifications, the basic structure of the UN is the same today as it was at its inception. The head of the organization is the Secretary General, who is elected on a 5-year term. Nearly all Secretary Generals have been career diplomats. There are 5 main active bodies or organs of the United Nations. The Trusteeship Council suspended its operations indefinitely in 1994. The 5 main bodies are the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the International Court of Justice, and the UN Secretariat. The International Court of Justice is based in The Hague in the Netherlands, while the other 4 are all in New York. This is basically what they do. The General Assembly is the main decision-making body of the UN. Every year in September, representatives from all 193 member countries meet to discuss and often vote on the most important and relevant issues. Heads of state often attend these meetings, where members discuss matters relating to peace, security, and the admission of new members. For key issues such as these, decisions are made based on a 2/3 majority vote. The Security Council is one of the busiest bodies of the United Nations. Its main role is to ensure ongoing international peace and, security. Naturally, this is easier said than done, with conflicts and uprisings occurring regularly around the world. The Council has 15 members, 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent. When the Council comes to a decision, all other member countries are obligated to accept it. In the case of more serious incidents, sanctions may be imposed and even intervention. UN intervention comes in the form of peacekeeping forces. Their main role is to provide humanitarian aid and act as negotiators as opposed to using actual force. The UN doesn't have its own army and instead calls upon the forces of member countries. There are currently around 97,000 troops available to be used for UN-designated missions. The Economic and Social Council is primarily responsible for overseeing the UN's economic, social, and humanitarian activities. The Council formulates ideas for discussion by the General Assembly and supervises UN programs relating to issues including population control, human rights, and social development. The International Court of Justice is the UN's main judicial body. It deals with cases relating to disputes between countries or states and offers legal advice submitted to it by other agencies. The ICJ settles all cases under guidelines of international law. The types of cases range from territorial fishing and mining disputes to asylum seeking and lawsuits. The Secretariat carries out the day-to-day operations of the United Nations. This includes supervising peacekeeping missions, organizing conferences, and taking care of the considerable UN administrative duties. So, how effective has the UN actually been? Some would argue that it's failed in its main goal, which is to ensure a safe and secure international community. However, this is surely an impossible task, and the UN's main contribution has been in areas relating to human rights and climate change. Critics often point to the Security Council's flawed structure that has 5 permanent member nations, as well as allowing them the right to veto. This is where things get murky, because if an issue arises concerning one of the permanent members, then the country will quite likely opt to veto any suggested resolutions. Russia has used its veto powers several times, most recently in regard to Syria and Ukraine. China has opted to use it several times, often in accordance with Russia. The US has vetoed matters dealing with its foreign policy, especially relating to Israel. The UN was powerless to prevent the invasions of Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Hungary, or genocide in countries such as Rwanda or Bosnia. More recently, it's failed to have any influence over atrocities in Syria and the war in Ukraine. Vetoes have often disrupted what should be a straightforward resolution, which fuels the debate. Should the veto system be done away with and have issues resolved by simple majority votes? This may certainly happen, especially if other countries are admitted into the Security Council as permanent members. A more representative United Nations would surely have to include permanent members from each continent. Countries such as Brazil, India, Germany, Japan, and South Africa must surely be considered. No Latin American or African countries are represented as permanent members, which should absolutely change. Yet, despite the criticism, the United Nations can be proud of its many initiatives that have paved the way for making the world a more equal, a more livable place. The UN has assisted in brokering major international treaties, such as the much-needed nuclear non-proliferation treaty that was implemented in 1970. The United Nations has helped set up historic elections, such as in Afghanistan and Cambodia. Huge steps forward in humanitarian aid are also due to the UN. UNICEF has helped reduce the deaths of children under 5 from nearly 12 million per year in 1990 to 6.9 million. The United Nations Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, has come to the aid of almost 18 million asylum seekers and refugees, while its World Food Program provides aid to 80 million people in 75 countries. The UN has also worked tirelessly to promote awareness and action towards climate change. In 1997, the historic Kyoto Protocol was set up to bring world leaders together to discuss future climate strategies. This was advanced in 2015 in Paris with the Climate Change Accord. Global heads of state met, and they agreed on specific emission and reduction targets, although progress since then has been somewhat, stalled. The world was a complicated place when the United Nations was set up, and it remains that way. On paper, ensuring international peace and security may seem well-meaning, but in reality, it's a massively difficult task. While other international bodies such as NATO have been more effective in stepping in to end conflicts, the United Nations has certainly proved its worth on a humanitarian and diplomatic scale. Perhaps in the future, with a more democratic and inclusive restructuring, the United Nations will become truly effective in creating a more stable and peaceful world. A former UN Secretary General probably best summed it up when he said, "The UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell." We can certainly hope.